Joyride, a novel of intrigue by J.P. Wasmiller, Chapter 114. He soon realized he needed gas and filled the big Ford up with ethyl in Olympia, the capital of Washington State. For an instant, as he drove by, he thought he saw the Capitol dome, but then it was gone. He rolled on through Washington State and then remembered he had one detour he needed to make. He'd almost forgotten in all the excitement or whatever it was. He arrived in Longview, Washington by 2 p.m. and then turned west onto State Highway 4. Drove about an hour and passed through a town called Roseburg. He was becoming more attuned to anything that had to do with roses, but this little burg was nothing more than a country store. The fog now got heavier as he drove west, but finally reached his destination, Ilwaco. It was a small town, but lay very near the mouth of the Columbia River and was just north of Cape Disappointment, the headland of the Columbia River on the northern or Washington side. James remembered from yesterday's research that the British fur trader John Meares was sailing south toward this cape in search of trade, but turned the ship around just before reaching the mouth of the Columbia River in 1788. 4 years later, George Vancouver, another British explorer, discovered the mouth of the Columbia. He also mapped out much of the northwest coast and named Mount Baker, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Rainier, among others, after his friends. The fog was still heavy, and James remembered that this area had the equivalent of 106 days of fog every year, the foggiest place on earth. He hunted for and finally found a room near the beach. He then went for supper at the Disappointment Cafe. But he was not disappointed. The red snapper was some of the best he'd ever eaten. It was topped off with apple pie a la mode. As he stood up to pay the bill, a man in the next booth noticed him. He was in a dark smock with a white collar. James did not notice him, but the man was sure he recognized James' face, though he could not remember where. After James paid and left, the man in the dark suit returned to his little house next to the little St. Mary's Church in Seaview, the town just north of Ilwaco. He tried making a call, but the phone lines were dead. He undressed and slipped into bed, deciding he would call in the morning. James slept well. The last few weeks had been a joyride of epic proportions, and he really had no idea how exhausted he had become. He was overwhelmed by the fact that his headache seemed gone and he was still alive and maybe on the right track. He fell asleep holding the redhead in his arms, actually a faded yellow pillow. He did not awake until nearly noon, and peering out his window, all he could see was more fog. He had planned to get up early and explore Cape Disappointment, then take the ferry across the river to Astoria. But he now realized there would be no ferry running this day, and he surmised probably a few more days or even a week. He went to the Disappointment Cafe for lunch and was again not disappointed. The prime rib sandwich was to die for, and the fries were as crispy as could be. Then fired up the big Ford and headed the few miles south to Cape Disappointment. It was at this spot that on November 15, 1805, Lewis and Clark first saw the Pacific Ocean on their 2,000-mile journey through the western United States. James spent the afternoon tramping all over the Cape in the pea soup. London fog had nothing over this fog, he surmised, having spent time in both. He knew the Indians had been here forever, but he wondered if the French fur traders had known about this spot far earlier than in 1792. He wondered, in fact, if this might not be the point that the 1363 expedition may have discovered the Pacific and, in fact, the Northwest Passage. If, in fact, they had got onto the Columbia River, they would most likely have ended up exactly here. He searched the entire beach area looking for ruins or anything out of the ordinary, but on this day came up empty. His best guess was that the party of explorers ended up viewing the Pacific from here, just like Lewis and Clark did. But of course there was James Line X running from Rhode Island through Kelowna and Penrose Island. Then there was the other line, the 18-degree line that bounced off the Canadian border and ran southwest into Seattle and then the middle of the Washington coast. What kept bothering him about all this was the fact that Lewis and Clark, for the most part, were treated very cordially by the Indians all across the Northwest. It seemed to James that this would be extremely unlikely unless there had been prior contact, and not just that of the fur traders, but contact over a long period of time. It was as if these Indians knew white men long, long before Lewis and Clark came through the Northwest United States in 1804 and 1805. In the interim, James had done some more measuring and determined that a line 30 degrees off the U.S.-Canadian border, angling southeast from the point where the United States and Canadian borders met at the British Columbia-Alberta border, the point now he was calling ABC Point, led through not only Texarkana, but also Key West, Florida. Bouncing this line, that is 30 degrees from the ABC point to the southwest of the Canadian border, created a line that ran southwest right through the Columbia River mouth and was very near to Portland, Oregon. It was all confusing.